ladies, gents, and non-binary mates, and welcome back to Beauty in the Bookcase, where we take a book and we make a look. Now, before we get started, make sure you follow me here, and right over here, so you can keep up with everything I'm doing whenever I'm not on YouTube. So today we're going to be going over Twisted Tales of the Ritalin Club, which is a graphic novel written by Yungblud and by Ryan O'Sullivan. So if you don't know who Yungblud is, his real name is Dominic Harrison. He is from Doncaster in England, and he rose to fame a few years ago and has been, kind of in the pop punk alternative scene for a while now, and a lot of his music, as well as the stuff that he uses his platform for, has been discussing kind of social justice issues as well as mental health issues. He is 24 now, but he actually started his music career when he was just 19, and he actually attracted a lot of attention with his song King Charles, which was just kind of asking for young people's voices to actually be heard and considered, and denouncing some of the issues he was seeing in England. So Ryan O'Sullivan is from Yorkshire, and he is professionally a comic book writer. He has been published by Image Comics, Titan, and TPub. Some of his work includes Eisenhorn. He did a Warhammer comic book called Dawn of War, and he's currently working on Void Trip. And so the comic, the way it's set up, it's written as 4 different parts, and so each part has a different artist, which I thought was interesting. Some people were not super crazy about the idea, and we'll get to that later towards the end of the video, but honestly it kind of made me think of like James Joyce, which I know is probably an odd comparison. But anyway, the only reason I bring up the comparison is because, Ulysses kind of had a different style every chapter, and that was pretty disorienting and continues to be disorienting for a lot of people. So, yeah, they did that here with the art style. And I do want to give credit. So part 1 was done by Derek Jones, part 2 by Jen Hickman, part 3 by Goran Gilgovic, and part 4 by Ian McGinty. A couple of things before we get into it. I will be referring to Yungblud, the person, like the real person, and the author as Dom or Dominic throughout, because there is a character also called Yungblud, and that would be very confusing. So when I say Dom or Dominic, I'm speaking about him as an author and an artist. When I'm saying Yungblud, I'm speaking specifically about the character. Other than that, graphic novels and comic books are not my area of expertise. I just want to make that clear that I am approaching this the same way that I would approach kind of any novel, so I'm really just focusing on themes and not so much on like how loyal this is to the structure of a comic book, because or a graphic novel, because I'm not very familiar with like the conventions of the genre. Anyway, let's get into it. So the story takes place between Blackheart's academy and this like other place that isn't really named. Like, I know you have to go through like the dark place to get there, but I'm not entirely sure where the Ritalin Club is based. But anyway, you're between like their little hub and then Blackheart's academy. So you start off there in the academy, and we are quickly introduced to our main character, whose name is M. So she is a student at this academy where everyone is forced to wear these masks, and they have to take this medication every day, and if you break any of their rules, or if you seem to not be complying with their expectations of what it means to be a student at Blackheart's, I don't know why I pronounced that so weird, you'd get in trouble. So of course Emily doesn't take her medication that day, because the usually like gray pill is actually pink that day. So she's like, yeah, that seems suspicious, I should probably not take that. and she gets in trouble for it, for not taking her medication, and eventually, through some things that I will let you explore on your own, her mask ends up like breaking, and she actually realizes that the world that she thought she knew is not anything like what they've been told and what they're being indoctrinated. So in an attempt to rescue her from Mr. White and his gun, Yungblud ends up rescuing her and kind of pulling her through this like void, which is called the dark place. And it's through that she then finally meets the Ritalin Club. So then the club is led by Yungblud, who is kind of he's a pretty lighthearted kind of leader. I think a lot of times leaders tend to be fairly serious, kind of no nonsense kind of people. But yeah, Yungblud is a lot more relaxed. He's very lighthearted, but he does have to wrestle with this darkness inside him that, stems a lot from his own anxieties and fears and self-doubt. Okay, so next we meet Harmony. So Harmony is actually a non-binary person with a very quick temper, and they constantly feel like the underdog because everyone else in the group, including Emily, who finds out later on, has powers except for them. So, their power is just fighting people. And so they kind of had to work really hard for it. And so there is kind of like this feeling of being, still different. Their introduction is followed by Scout. So Scout is a mermaid. He's also super in love with Harmony, but apparently they had a relationship in the past that did not end well. A lot of that is due to kind of Harmony's insecurities, so they kind of have to wrestle with that. Then there is Zombie Joshua. Pretty self-explanatory. He is a zombie whose name is Joshua. He has a pretty, tragic backstory, but again, I don't want to spoil that for you. But he and M kind of start having like feelings for each other, so they're kind of like the main love interests. And he's just the sweetest. I love him. We love Zombie Joshua. Lastly, there is Encore, who can summon weapons. They can do some pretty cool tricks with their wheelchair, or as Yungblud put it, Encore is just like Jason Bourne. But they also struggle to see themselves as a hero because, again, their main skill is fighting, and they don't feel like heroes should be hurting other people. And Encore is also Yungblud's number 2, but they do kind of have to take the brunt of the fighting because Yungblud tries to be as peaceful as possible, but in a comic book world and sometimes in real life it is kind of difficult to avoid physical altercations for the sake of justice. But together they finally have enough people. They needed 6 people to be able to defeat the headmaster of Blackheart's, just so they can stop kind of brainwashing children. So first and foremost, I would say that this is very much a story about belonging, but also about not fitting in. So it's a lot of these ideas of misfits and outcasts and people who are kind of rejected by society or their own family or friends, just generally kind of on their own, finally being able to find a group to fit into and feel less alone. This is very much kind of emphasized throughout the story through color. So in the academy, everything is very much in these muted, neutral tones. It's very much like blacks and whites and shades of gray and beige, and that's reflected as well in the teacher's name. So you have beige and vanilla and white. It's all very much, I don't know, it just feels very industrial or prison to me. That I think when I think of that color palette, I think of prison. So it's very much like that. And everyone kind of has to wear these masks, and everything's just kind of pretty empty, and there is no individuality, right? Everyone is almost anonymous because of their uniformity. So the school continuously, as I said, forces students to take these gray pills that essentially like keeps them kind of like from trying to rebel or question. So it keeps them kind of like asleep. And this is probably, again, this is conjecture, but this is probably inspired by Dom's own relationship to like medication. So he is very vocal about having ADHD, and he was on Ritalin when he was younger, and he did feel that it kind of, it kind of put his entire personality to sleep, and he, that did not jam well with him. So that gray pill is probably very much kind of meant to represent those types of medications that, often are potentially overprescribed. Like, I think there is a place for them. As somebody who has ADHD and who did take medication for it, I would say that they helped me to focus. They definitely did kind of make me very quiet, and I didn't really discover that I had a personality or was a social person until I stopped taking them in like college. But I mean, I think there are, as with everything, there is good and bad, but there is kind of a tendency of maybe overprescribing things like Ritalin to people who maybe don't need it for the sake of focusing, and they're just kind of like loud personalities. And anyway, I'm not a mental health professional, so I'm not going to discuss stuff about medication. Anyway, so those who free themselves are able to see the world, without the mask, but they do also have to carry with them the reality of, their not so good moments, and at times for some of the characters, as we go on to learn, they also have to face kind of like their worst moments in these like very dark, heavy moments that, they have to kind of overcome throughout the story. But at the same time, when the mask does come off, there is a little bit more of joy and individuality, and aesthetically there is a lot more color and a lot more vibrancy, even in the way like that the characters are written, right? Everything is very robotic when the masks are on, or it's kind of cold, and it's very like machine-like, versus when the masks are off, they're obviously way more human. One of the biggest tensions in the story, outside of issues with the academy, is actually between Em and her mom. So in the last part, Yungblud is impersonating a teacher. So they were having like this graduation ceremony for the academy, and the Ritalin Club is basically there to like bring down the headmaster. But I guess there was kind of like a parent-teacher conference thing going on as well before the ceremony, and so Yungblud is impersonating one of Emily's teachers, and he's just genuinely being nice, just saying that Emily is good and smart and all these lovely things that any parent should want to hear about their child. But Em's mom just entirely refuses to accept any of that, and starts very much talking down, like talking Em down, like being like, no, I know she's a brat, and I know she's difficult, and blah blah blah, and kind of it does expose us to what she's had to grow up with, and the fact that she probably was put in this academy because mom didn't want to try and figure out why maybe she was acting out, if she was acting out, or why she was struggling with whatever she was struggling in her life before the academy. And so we do get to see that there is this very difficult thing of a parent rejecting their child. So Em feels really hurt and isolated from her family, and she has to learn a tough lesson that unfortunately is that family isn't always a safe place that it's meant to be. And it's I think as somebody who has a pretty good kind of relationship with my family, it's always very, well, it was not so much anymore, but it used to be very difficult for me to understand why people would, like, hate their parents or not want to speak to them again. But as I've gotten older and I've met more people, I've realized that I'm, I was looking at the world from a very privileged perspective of having a safe home and a good family, and unfortunately not everybody has that. So I do think that at times, sometimes with the dialogue, I was kind of just like, okay, this feels a little bit like aggressive, cliche teenager. But the reality of it was, right, especially when I got to that part, seeing, M's mom's reaction, I was like, well, this isn't just a kid throwing a tantrum over not getting an iPad. This isn't some kid actually being entitled and bratty and saying these things to hurt their parents, but because, or, to get their way, but genuinely being a child who has been abandoned by their parents, and that's obviously awful. And yeah, I think it definitely helped me kind of connect a little bit more and see it less as just kind of like cliche teenage angst, and being like, well, how would you feel if your parents kind of spoke about you this way and refused to accept any praise or see any of like the good in you? But all of that to say that despite this difficult relationship and this difficult realization of having to let go, does find a new family in the Ritalin Club, and that's, I think found family is just as important. Even if you do have like a good family, I think having people who aren't, biologically related to you, who care about you and have your best interest at heart and take care of you and protect you, it's really important for anyways. And I think anyone can still relate to that, even if you do have like a good relationship with your family. So the Ritalin Club itself does stand in complete contrast to everything else really in this world, to the academy and to M's mom. There's lots of pinks and greens and just vibrant colors. There's a lot more self-expression. They are this group for anybody who doesn't belong. And, I guess, again, kind of making connections with real life. You could connect the Ritalin Club to Dominic's Blackheart's club, which is what he calls like his fans, and kind of this place where anybody who doesn't have friends or who doesn't fit in or who feels outcasted for whatever reason does have a sense of belonging and safety in a found family. Although they are all haunted kind of by the worst moments of their lives, there isn't ever like a sense of judgment. They don't really see each other as broken people. They're just kind of people who have overcome and survived a lot of challenges, and who are trying to be good and are also trying to help other people not feel isolated and not feel like they don't belong. So one of the other running themes of this story is mental health and the kind of notion of this darkness inside of the characters, and that's very much influenced by the outside world as well as their own internal worries and anxieties. So when traveling through the dark place, at the start of the story, M kind of has to hear her darkest thoughts. So that's our first introduction to it. So then this is later on echoed when Yungblud is taken hostage by what ends up basically being just like a physical manifestation of his darkest thoughts and anxieties. And when his friends go to rescue Yungblud, so they all kind of have to have this moment of feeling uncomfortable and having to face their own self-doubt and their own concerns and anxieties and worries. And a lot of the things that are there are things that unfortunately I think a lot of people struggle with. So, I mean, it's relatable, which is great, and it's such an important thing to talk about, but it's also one of those things that you're kind of just like, I wish nobody could relate, because I wish nobody had to feel this way, you know? You know, it's these thoughts about not feeling like you're good enough, or like you think that you're not a good person, or feeling alone, or that you're dragging other people down. And, you know, continuously characters need to have a fight with these inner thoughts and understand them, you know, that they are kind of there, but they don't define who they are as people, and that they're not their worst moments, and that they have the ability to be better, and that they can still be heroes and good people despite, you know, the things that they've experienced. But on a much darker note, you know, the book uses themes of ending one's own life, and the growing trend of students kind of ending the lives of their classmates as a way to cope with the pain. You have, you know, outside of Blackheart, it's quite jarring, is this kind of man in like an ice cream van, and, you know, he'll suggest to students kind of like, well, if you failed at, like, you know, unaliving yourself, why not, like, take your classmates with you? Then you'll, like, be remembered, and you'll make it to the news, and you'll get this attention that you need, or you're looking for. And it's very much presented as an exit for those who have failed to unalive themselves. I hate using the word failed. It's a good thing that, you know, you're still here. I've struggled with those issues and thoughts myself, so not a failure. Just want to put that out there. But, you know, it's very clear that Dominic and O'Sullivan's intention isn't to, like, promote this or be like, hey, this is what you should do. They're very much taking a clear stance against it, but they're also kind of trying to highlight where, you know, kids are getting these ideas from, right? And a lot of it comes from this temptation to prove people wrong, or to just, you know, to just feel like you have to take drastic measures to get help, because just being like, hey, I'm not well, you know, isn't unfortunately taken seriously. So I do think that's kind of a very interesting approach, but it's pretty dark, and it comes up a few times throughout, and it did kind of catch me off guard every time. I was just like, what? But yeah, I mean, I do think that it's, despite the fact that, you know, this is a fairly lighthearted story, and the dialogue is usually quite, you know, fun and upbeat, you know, there is this darkness that does kind of permeate and guide the story. So the last component that kind of stood out to me from the story was the topics of sexuality and gender identity, or gender expression. So, you know, straight off the bat, we have Harmony, who physically represents kind of the non-binary identity, so kind of feeling as both male and female, but also like something completely different, but you know, entirely themselves. And I think that, you know, that's a point that Harmony wants to make, right? It's like, I'm not two halves of something, I'm just myself, and I'm always them. Like they say that in like their first introduction. It's like, sometimes I'm he, sometimes I'm she, but I'm always they, you know. And you know, the bigger section that kind of handles this topic is in part 2. So they run into Mrs. Beige, who's kind of the school art teacher, and she has like this magic easel that can like conjure up anything into existence. Plays part of the story, not gonna spoil it for you though. But you know, her presence kind of sends the characters into these like sexual frenzies, and you know, their emotions and their desires kind of take over. But you know, I do think that, you know, there is a lightheartedness about the way this topic is treated. You know, not in a way to like treat it as a joke, or treat it as like, you know, I don't know. It's not trying to be flippant, and kind of normalize it, I guess. Kind of normalize having that conversation, and, discussing the fact that yes, you know, people have desires and emotions, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you know, again, there's no shame, and you do get to see that there is still, you know, character development and happening. You know, you still get to see the characters kind of becoming closer with each other, and not just, you know, romantically, but also platonically. Like their relationships are also kind of like explored a little bit more. So yeah, I mean, I think in terms of critiques, I mean, I briefly mentioned the art thing in the beginning. Personally, I didn't really have a problem with it. Like as a whole, I thought it was cool kind of seeing the different art styles, and I had a fairly good grasp on who these characters were. Like visually I could be like, okay, this is this and this, you know, I had a clear understanding, so that didn't really bother me as much as it did some other people. However, I can understand how, you know, if you don't have fully established characters, right, and this is the first time these characters are being introduced, kind of continuously changing up the art style could be a little bit confusing for the reader, because, you know, there's a difference between, like, if you take like the Spider-Verse, right? Like everyone knows Spider-Man, so everyone knows what Spider-Man is supposed to look like, and whether he's human or a robot or a pig, you know that that's Spider-Man. Versus here, you know, I think because they're not as established, that was probably part of like the reason why some people didn't really gel with the idea. Yeah, maybe having like a little bit more of like a consistent or similar art style could kind of solve that. Like you could still have different artists, but kind of have them done in like a specific art style throughout. But I also think it would be interesting even to just actually use the different art styles in the plot, like to include them to represent like emotions or, you know, changes, you know, like if you had like really emotional scenes and the characters are feeling kind of insecure, they could be, you know, a lot more rounded and maybe like a little bit more abstract and kind of, I don't know, not as defined, I guess. And then you could have moments where they're being very confident and they're being heroes and have sharper lines and like brighter colors, you know, stuff like that could be interesting as well. In terms of the story itself, I think it did a really great job of using humor as a way to cover up certain things, you know, that I would be like, why are we doing this? And then like they'd make a joke about it and I'd be like, I'm glad you're self-aware. But I mean, I do think I would like to see a little bit more purpose behind like all of the writing decisions throughout and not just some of them. So for example, in part 2, we are introduced to Encore and Zombie Joshua's kind of backstory, but it's like being told to us while there's a fight happening, but like both of these things are happening simultaneously. And I mean, it's funny because they kind of go just like, what's going on with them? They're like, ugh, backstory. And, you know, it ends up being kind of like, yeah, you shouldn't have been distracted by backstory because it caused like a problem. And I do think that it's like important to have that information, obviously, because we need to understand who these characters are. And I do understand as well that the pacing of, you know, a graphic novel does have, you know, you don't have 300 pages like you do in a novel. You know, you don't have all of that time to be like, here's exposition. But I think you can find ways to provide exposition without literally just being like, here is exposition. Lastly, in terms of characters, I would love to see a clearer distinction between Harmony and Encore. I mean, physically the distinction is there, but I think their backstories kind of overlapped for me to the point where sometimes I wasn't like sure who was who, because they both kind of have these struggles with tempers and, you know, regulating their emotions, and they're kind of always feeling like, oh god, all I'm good for is fighting, and what does that say about me as a person? And I think that's such an important point, and I think that they can both still have that but have their journeys be a little bit more distinct. Because I did have, even while I was kind of writing the script for this video, I had to keep going back and being like, wait, was this Harmony or was this Encore? And like, you know, I would get them switched around. So I think they have a lot of potential. So I think just, you know, and maybe all these things have been addressed in the second book. I don't know. I haven't read it yet. But yeah, I think just being able to kind of define them a little bit more so they're as distinct as the other characters. So what's it all about? At its core, The Twisted Tales of the Ritalin Club is a story about belonging, overcoming mental health struggles, and finding yourself. Dom and Ryan did a great job of creating these compelling characters in a fictitious world that is often too close to ours, but in the best way. While some stories need you to believe in the world of the story for it to function, the world of the Ritalin Club is all too familiar to many of us. But, to quote Yungblud, "It's alright, we'll survive." As always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and let me know in the comments what your favorite Yungblud song is. Mine is probably Tin Pan Boy. I listen to that song an unhealthy amount of times every day. But yes, don't forget to subscribe for more bookish content like this, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you know exactly when I upload next, and I will see you all next time.